So Union Station here has a small little museum type thing. I'll show you some of that stuff.
Because of these complexities, train crews operate under the Federal Railroad Administration's hours of service rules. Crews can
No idea if you guys can read any of these cards or anything like that, but just giving you an idea what's in here. This lantern over here is pretty cool though. I do like that. Bygone year. Bonds? Yeah, look, gold bonds, yes. Interesting.
into a bustling economic powerhouse of the early 19th century. And what roles did trains have in this? Let's find out as we look back on the history of railroads in St. Paul. When Minnesota Territory achieved statehood in 1858, fewer than 200,000 people were living within its borders. Transportation was largely by riverboat, horse, or ox cart. St. Paul was the last stop on the river for boats due to the falls that continue up the river. Because of this, Minnesota's network of waterways have provided the state with urban lakes for the exchange of raw materials, manufactured goods, and passenger transport.
St. Paul is the head of navigation on the Mississippi River. St. Paul was the last place that river boats could easily pull into shore, and more importantly, horse and wagons could get up the hill out of the river valley. Railroads connect rivers. Railroads go east and west, rivers go north and south. So the very falls that stopped river traffic provided power in Minneapolis for lumber mills and eventually flour mills. St. Paul is uniquely situated in a place where river boats could easily get to the shore and then get people and produce and merchandise unloaded off those boats and up the boat.
Minnesota quickly established chains of supply and demand in ore and timber. But for Minnesota to grow into an economic powerhouse, it needed better transportation with more direct routes than rivers. By 1873, Minnesota railroads had laid 1,902 miles of railroad track and established themselves as the prominent transport industry of the North. 9 railroads joined to form the St. Paul Union Depot Company in 1879 to better serve passengers traveling on the multiple routes available. James J. Hill, nicknamed the Empire Bill, the effort to create a single passenger terminal known as Union Depot in St. Paul.
It was the railroads, founded by James J. Hill, the Great Northern Railway, that allowed for the delivery of goods and merchandise from companies like Pillsbury and General Mills to be shipped all over the country and all over the world. It enabled farmers from Minnesota to have markets for their products.
Work began on the state's first railroad line in 1861 in St. Paul. 500 tons of rail, 2 freight cars, and a locomotive were shipped to St. Paul by Mississippi River barge. The first 10 miles of track was laid, and the William Crooks, named for the chief engineer of the line, was ready to pull the first train, marking the beginning of the railroad industry in St. Paul and making it the center of distribution for goods in the Midwest.
The history of the Jackson Street Roundhouse is really the history of this region and the history of the Pacific Northwest. Think about what made St. Paul a great city. It was the river and it was the railroads. Sometimes we often hear about St. Louis, Missouri being the gateway to the West. Well, St. Paul was really the gateway to the Pacific Northwest. It was through here that people came up the river or across the railroad to settle Minnesota and move on from here to settle the Pacific Northwest.
Settlers moved to areas along the newly constructed railroad lines, and St. Paul quickly became a hub of activity. The Milwaukee Road built a line from Chicago to St. Paul, and the Northern Pacific opened a transcontinental line to Tacoma, Washington in 1883. A decade later, Great Northern opened their own line to Seattle, giving St. Paul 2 transcontinental railroads. Now, more than ever, St. Paul was physically linked to the rest of the country in a powerful way. Railroads opened the door for economic growth on a national scale in St. Paul. Commodities and passengers flowed between city centers, and as a result, smaller towns on the railroad lines began to urbanize. Minnesota became prominent among the largest railroads in the country. St. Paul sat at a crucial junction between the east and west, making it the perfect location for railroads to build their headquarters. The growth of St. Paul necessitated a means of transport the public could use to access a now sprawling metropolitan area, which led to the emergence of the streetcar. But it was another new technology that spurred growth by making freight train travel more efficient. Roundhouses.
Steam engine is designed to go forward only. They do go backwards, but not well and not fast. So in order to turn them around, there's only 2 ways to do it. There is either the turntable, which is basically a pivot, or what is called a Y. That's the only 2 ways that you can turn a steam engine. So steam engines required a turntable at the end of the line.
Roundhouses became an important economic tool that helped the railroad industry in St. Paul expand. The Great Northern Railway had constructed a wooden roundhouse in St. Paul to maintain locomotives, but it quickly became too small to accommodate the growing need. The railroad replaced it with a larger stone roundhouse and turntable on Jackson Street in 1907. This was a critical step that helped further connect St. Paul to cities all across the Midwest.
The history of the Jackson Street Roundhouse is really the history of this region and the history of the Pacific Northwest. This facility was the primary maintenance facility for the Great Northern Railroad. It was at this building that they maintained their locomotives. It was in buildings on these grounds where they maintained their cars. Just over this way is where meals were prepared for travelers on the Great Northern Railway. This building and this neighborhood was the heart of a railroad that made the city and helped build the Pacific Northwest.
To avoid losing this important piece of history, the Minnesota Transportation Museum took possession of the Jackson Street Roundhouse in 1986 and restored it as an operational roundhouse, one of the last of its kind in the country. It can still be seen in action today as the Minnesota Transportation Museum uses it to help restore rail cars back to their former glory. The museum also houses exhibitions, archives, and an audiovisual theater, plus several steam and diesel locomotives, passenger and freight cars, and cabooses on display. For a true taste of the past, you can even purchase tickets to ride one of their multiple active trains. So be sure to look for the Minnesota Transportation Museum the next time you're in St. Paul.